asked if I would talk a little bit about how to achieve the good, and well, I'll tell you in a minute and leave. But on the other hand, there is a bit of a backstory which is worth knowing about, and that is that very, very first thing to clock in thinking about the nature of the moral life or about ethics is that the concept of ethics and the concept of morality, two different concepts. You very often hear people saying ethics and morals, or ethics or morals, as if they were the same thing. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And you can tell why, just dig back into your classical studies. The word ethics has an ancient Greek etymology. It comes from the word ethos, which means character, the kind of person you are, the kind of life you live, even indeed the kind of the character that a community has, like ancient Athens or Thebes. The word morals comes from a Latin word, cognate to the word mores, which means customs or etiquette, the way people behave. In fact, it was Cicero, and you may have been reading Cicero in the bath last night, so you will remember, in fact, it was his coining, where he was trying to translate the word ethics from Greek into Latin. And he chose this word, morals, because he thought that what the Greeks were talking about was about how people relate to one another. And yes, indeed, he was right about that, because morality is about our responsibilities and duties, the way that we treat other people. But there lies the clue. The ethical considerations are much broader, much more inclusive than moral considerations. Your morality, how you behave, how you see your responsibilities to others, will flow from your ethics, that is, from how you think life ought to be lived. But it won't exhaust your ethics. The simplest and quickest way to describe this is to say it's an ethical matter what colour you paint the front door of your house, but it's not a moral matter, not at least unless it's such a hideous colour that it really upsets the neighbours, but you refuse to take any notice of their complaints, well then it might be a moral matter. So ethics is about the choices we make, about our values, the values that shape and colour the lives that we lead. And morality tends to be much, much more a matter of what emerges out of a contemporary consensus of what people agree about the boundaries of behaviour and those responsibilities that we have to one another. And there is a really important insight, which is that moralities change. There's a kind of pendulum swing backwards and forwards to the more liberal and then to the less liberal, more puritanical and then the less puritanical. And if you look back across the landscape of history, you see how very different moral attitudes can be from one time to another. It's very remarkable. You look at the 17th century in this country. In the first half of the 17th century, you had the Puritans. Eventually they managed to close down the theatres by law in the 1640s. By the 1660s and 1670s, after the Restoration, you had people like the Earl of Rochester writing obscene poems and publishing them. And there was a dramatic change of outlook. The 18th century was on the whole reasonably liberal, and the 19th century not. There were the Victorians allegedly covering up the legs of their pianos because they were regarded as a bit rude. So there you had the pendulum going backwards and forwards as well. And the same thing happened in the 20th century. The Roaring Twenties. Not very many of us remember them personally, but they are said to have been a very exciting and open-minded kind of time. Whereas after the Second World War in the 1950s, there was a crackdown, for example, on gays. Alan Turing is a famous case in point. He was persecuted, people say prosecuted, but persecuted really because of his sexuality. As it happens, the 1960s followed hard upon, and with a Home Secretary like Roy Jenkins, there were one or two sensible things done about the position that women had in relation to their own fertility, for example, to the decriminalisation of homosexual activity, and it was an era, a very liberating and liberated era. Indeed, I was there. I've got the hairstyle, as you can see, so I remember that things were much more open and fresher in outlook than had been the case before. We may now be living in a somewhat more puritanical phase, or the pendulum might be swinging back again. You only have to page through, not even the Daily Mail, God forbid, but the Times newspaper to see that those stories about vicars and choir boys are back in full flood. So it could be that there is a return, really, of of a slightly more anxious and puritanical outlook. So morality's changed, the pendulum goes backwards and forwards. But ethical considerations, thinking about the nature of the well-lived and worthwhile life, that doesn't tend to be a matter of pendulums. On the contrary, it tends to be a great perennial debate. And it very often happens that when the pendulum on morality has swung too far in one direction or another, it is ethical reflection that stops it and starts to bring it back into a more balanced focus. And why is this so? Well, let us have a look at how the great debate about ethics in our civilization, Western civilization, arose. And familiarly, of course, it arose from that discussion that classical antiquity had with itself about this question. In fact, it is attributed to no less a person than Socrates himself, who was said to have gone around Athens challenging his fellow Athenians to consider the question, what is a life worth living? What sort of person should one be? How should one live one's life? What really matters? And even more importantly, in a way, those concepts, those ideas that we use when we think about the good, concepts like the good itself, like continence, courage, kindness, generosity, what do we really mean by those concepts? How do we apply them? If you go and take down your Platonic dialogue called the Meno, you read in there the story of how this rich young man, Meno, on a visit to Athens, after his day of business, decides to go out and sit under the olive tree with Socrates in order to ask him a really important question that was one of the burning questions of the day, namely, is virtue teachable? Can the upstanding citizens of Corinth and Thebes and Athens pass on their sense of virtue to their teenage children who were drinking too much ouzo and staying out late at night and getting pregnant, stealing chariots, doing wheelies around the city walls? I mean, really, those ancient teenagers, we can count our lucky stars that we live where we do now. But so he was really keen. Well, why is it that we seem that the older generation can't pass on their sense of virtue? And Socrates said, I don't know. Much to Meno's surprise. He said, well, how can you not know? I mean, you're Socrates. And Socrates said, well, I don't know, because I don't know the answer to a more fundamental question, and that is what virtue is. And of course, Meno was absolutely astonished. What? How can you not know what virtue is? Socrates said, well, I don't, do you? And Meno said, of course I do. And Socrates said, oh, thank God, I've met somebody at last. Well, you can see what happened then, because every effort that Meno made to define virtue was instantly demolished by Socrates, until finally Meno said, oh, Socrates, you're like a stingray, you've stung my lips and tongue, and I don't know what to say. And Socrates said, good, now that you don't know what you're talking about, we can begin to make progress. And this is a story I like to tell my students because it demonstrates that confusion is the beginning of wisdom. And so if my first students are confused, they're on the right track. This was Socrates' challenge, really, to get people to see that they weren't really clear because they hadn't really thought through what they meant by these ideas that give content to the idea of a well-lived life. And Socrates' own answer to the question is a very, very simple, but it's a very deep answer. He said, the well-lived life, the life worth living, is a considered life. That is a life thought about, a life chosen. And the assumption that lies behind that, and there are two very, very big assumptions. One of them is that there has to be a measure of self-understanding. One has to have thought a bit about what one is and what one can do, what one's capacities are. And the other is that there are as many possible good and worthwhile lives as there are people to live them. Because each one of us has an individual set of interests, of desires, of abilities, and putting them to work on the basis of one's self-understanding. Putting them to work to try to create good relationships with others, because after all, we are essentially social animals. We need our relationships. We need to give love and to receive it, to experience friendship, to be part of communities. So we have to think very seriously about how we live with others. But also, what action, what activity would really be fulfilling for us as individuals in our growth towards something that we regard as worthwhile. And this is a really, really key point, because you'll notice that it is utterly different from any view that says there is a one-size-fits-all answer to the question of what a good life is. There are plenty of great ideologies, mainly religious ideologies, but also political ones, which say this is how it should be for everybody. Everybody's got to think this, believe this, or behave a certain way, and then they're saved, or they're fine, or that the future is rosy. But the assumption that lies behind Socrates' simple, deep thought is that there are many, many different ways that lives can be good and flourishing, and there is not a one-size-fits-all answer. This is why when cab drivers ask me what I do, and I say, well, I teach philosophy, and you notice the careful choice of words, because if I said, I am a philosopher, put yourself in Manchester United first team along with Plato and Aristotle and so on. So I say, I teach philosophy. They think that I've said I am one, so there's a pause, because the cab driver is thinking, what the hell does a philosopher do when he gets up in the morning? Yeah. That is what you do. So then they say, all right then, what's the meaning of life? And I say, I know the answer to that question, not because I found it, but because the philosophical debate has offered it to us. It's a rich fruit, really, of the conversation that humanity has had with itself ever since classical antiquity about this idea, at least in those traditions outside the ones that say there's a one-size-fits-all answer. And the answer is, the meaning of your life is what you make it. And this is exactly the Socratic point, that reflection on oneself and on one's capacities gives us a sense of what is really worth doing or pursuing. This is what he meant by saying the considered life is the good life. The chosen or thought about life is the good life. He actually put it another way. He put it in the negative. He said the unconsidered life is not worth living. The unchosen life. The life lived according to other people's idea of what a good life is. The life in which you are a football in somebody else's football match. So that the direction you travel in, you've been kicked in by somebody else's choices. And alas, the vast majority of people live according to conventions, traditions, beliefs that other people have come up with, and which they've been told when they're little or as they're growing up or become a member of society, that this is the right way to go. Instead of having a boldness and taking the challenge, accepting the challenge, to think through what a life which is really full of achievement and worthwhileness is. Now, I often say, and this is something which is so worth repeating that at every opportunity I do repeat it, the wonderful story told by Herodotus, whom I'm sure you were reading in the original Greek last night in the bath also. And you remember, therefore, the story he tells about Solon on his visit to King Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was by far the richest individual of ancient times, and indeed we have a saying today, as rich as Croesus. He always had his guests taken down to the treasury to see this wonderful store of gold and jewellery and very valuable things that he had. And he would always ask his guests the same question when they came back up to have lunch with him. He would say, who in your opinion is the happiest man in the world? Thinking they would say, well, you're a king and you're so rich. And Solon, who was one of the 7 sages of Greece on a long journey around the ancient world, said to him, oh, I knew somebody back in the suburbs of Athens. He was the happiest man I've ever met. And Croesus was very offended. What? You choose a commoner over me? And Solon said, yes, because I don't know whether you're happy. By the way, of course, the ancients meant by happiness something which had a well-doing and well-being, a sort of vigorous, active connotation. We in our contemporary world think if you've got a glass of wine and a hamburger and a television set, you're happy. But they had a rather different conception of happiness in those days, a bit more robust. So Solon said, well, I don't know whether you're happy in that sense, but I do know how incredibly important it is to think about what would make you happy in that sense. Because, he said, and this is the point which one repeats endlessly at every opportunity, because, he said, of the brevity of life. That a human life is less than 1,000 months long. You do the maths. Supposing you live until you're 80, what's 12 times 80? Quick. Well, it's 960 months, 300 of which you're asleep. Another 300 of which you're in Tesco, or if you're a lucky Waitrose. So you're left with 300 months to live with all the vividness and passion that a human life should be full of. Now, when you mention this to people, they're a little bit alarmed. You know, I mentioned this to sixth form students, for example, making a school visit, and I tell them this, and of course, you know, when you're young, you're immortal, you don't even think about it. But then I say to them, by the way, how many months have you used up by the age of 20? Now they do a bit of maths. 240 out of the less than 1,000 months, even at the age of 20. Well, it does show you how fleeting it all is. One lesson of this, by the way, is that there's just no time to waste on quarrels, regrets, getting things, you know, worrying about mistakes that you've made. You just have to get on with it and you know, get something done, something worthwhile, and not bother about it. The other thing is, I remember once when I was teaching at Oxford and living in London, so commute backwards and forwards, and driving back one night from Oxford, thinking to myself, I wonder how much time I've got left. I did a bit of mental arithmetic. I thought, oh my God, I'm nearly dead. And I hadn't read any Smollett. I hadn't read any Smollett by that time. I got home, I said to my wife, I'm nearly dead and I haven't read any Smollett. She said, well, fortunately, we've got some on the bookcase here, so in the bath tonight, I started to read Smollett. And after about 4 pages or so, I chucked it out of the bath thinking, oh, thank God, I don't have to read that. When I got back to Oxford the next morning, you can imagine what one of my colleagues said when I showed him this. He said, Smollett is wonderful, you must read Smollett. I thought, I'm nearly dead and I must read Smollett. The pressure. Think about, you know, how demanding in a way life is when you're conscious of the brevity of it. The good news, there are 2 bits of good news, however. One is that 300 months is 25 years. So that's not too bad. I mean, you can get a bit of living done in that time. But the even better news than that, and you hear this officially from a philosopher or a teacher of philosophy, and that is that there is no such thing as time. There is only experience. It's very easy to prove this to you. Think of a weekend in Paris. While you're there forever. When you get home again, it's gone like this. Time is elastic. What there really is experience, not time. So that if you live richly, if you live with a fullness of experience, if you live along the pulses of life, then you live not 300 months, but 3,000 or 300 lifetimes. It's all about what you do with your life that makes it really worthwhile, really full. I mean, there are people who in their 1,000 months live far less than 1,000 months. For them, it's like eating their soup with a fork. They don't really live at all. And if experience becomes a matter of repetition and boredom, it was Walter Pater who said the great mistake in life is to form habits. And this is so true, because to live with alertness and richness and passion and vividness, to be really engaged, is to provide yourself with a very, very, very great extension of lifetime. And this is what comes out of the considered life, the life chosen, the life thought about. What is so fascinating about this Socratic challenge, which is a challenge that we are offered today, this very moment, this point on a Wednesday evening in the year 2015, it's still a live challenge, is that it came at a very extraordinary moment in history. A moment where you could hear the hinges of history creaking. And in fact, it's a moment which is captured wonderfully in one of Aeschylus's plays. So you know the Oresteia, the trilogy, which tells the story, well actually it tells that part of the story which has to be one of the greatest soap operas that ever to be offered us in world literature, because it goes all the way back to when Prince Paris, one of the sons of Priam of Troy, had to have a spell as a shepherd, you may remember, and while he was out there, he was visited by the 3 most senior goddesses of the Greek pantheon: Hera, the queen of the gods, Athene, the goddess of wisdom, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And they asked him, which of us is the most beautiful? And Hera said, if you choose me, it's nothing to do with the fact that they were Greek, that they offered him bribes or anything like that. She said, if you choose me, I will give you empire over great kingdoms. And Athene said, if you choose me, I will make you the wisest of men. And Aphrodite said, if you choose me, you can have any girl you like. He said, I'll choose you. And they laid it apart. And not very long afterwards, of course, he was on his embassy to the court of Sparta, court of King Menelaus of Sparta. And Menelaus was married to Helen, the beautiful Helen, the most beautiful woman of ancient times. And he used the magic that Aphrodite had given him, and he stole her away back to Troy. Now, Helen's beauty was so great that all the kings of Greece had competed for her hand, and Menelaus had been the lucky guy, so all the other kings had agreed that if anything ever happened to her, they would all club together to help Menelaus avenge her or get her back. And so he called in this favour, went to see his big brother, Agamemnon, who was the chief of the Greek kings, and said, my wife's been pinched away by this wretched Trojan prince. So Agamemnon got together a great fleet, a fleet of 1,000 ships. This is why Helen's beauty is said to have been sufficient to launch 1,000 ships. It gives you, by the way, a metric for beauty, a million. It's just enough beauty for one ship. They got together with the fleet, but they couldn't set sail. The winds were against them day after day, week after week. The troops started to get mutinous, the food started to run out, the ships started to rot. Agamemnon got a soothsayer to find out why it was that they couldn't get the winds to change. And the soothsayer said, one of your number has killed a creature sacred to the goddess of the hunt, Artemis, and you must offer her a sacrifice. And he said, what is this sacrifice? And the soothsayer said, your daughter, Iphigenia. So she was taken onto the island. Sacrifice. The winds changed. The fleet set sail off to Troy. War, 10 years and so on. Then most of them went home except for poor old Odysseus. Now Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra had, while he was away, taken a lover, Aegisthus, who wanted to be king in Agamemnon's place. Also, she was a bit peeved about having their daughter sacrificed and so on. So when Agamemnon got home, she and Aegisthus decided to marry him, which they did. And this is where the plot thickens, because they also had a son, Orestes. And in those palmy days, in the days when virtue was understood as warrior virtue, in fact, little footnote here, the word virtue has as its first syllable the word vir, V-I-R, or as my old Latin master used to say, weir, but he was a bit weird. So vir, it actually means man in the masculine sense in Latin. And it captures this ancient thing that virtue was strength, fortitude, courage. The virtue of the warrior who would protect the tribe or the city. So the warrior virtues were what is exemplified by Achilles and all the others in the great Homeric epics. So Orestes had the duty, in the context of warrior virtues, of avenging his father's murder. And since his mother had murdered his father, he had to kill his mother. So he did. And now he was in big trouble, because this bunch of minor gods in the Olympian pantheon called the Eringes, the Furies, and it's their job to torment, drive mad, and ultimately to destroy anybody who murders a parent. So they chased Orestes all over the Greek world. Well, finally, of course, he got to Delphi, where the god Apollo lives with his oracle, and he said to Apollo, oh dear, Apollo, I'm in a big fix here because my mum murdered my dad, I had to avenge my dad, so I murdered my mum, now the Furies are after me, what the heck am I going to do? Apollo said, I tell you what, go to Athens, where my sister Athene lives, she's smart, she'll sort something out for you. Meanwhile, I'll just temporarily put the Furies to sleep here so you can escape. So he got to Athens, he asked Athene what he should do, having explained his dilemma, and she said, I'll tell you what, we'll put you on trial. I'm going to summon a jury of the Athenians and we will put you on trial. So they had a trial, a court case. And Orestes had the very good fortune of having Apollo as his defense attorney. It's not bad going. Except that Apollo's argument was that Orestes hadn't murdered a parent because a mother isn't a parent, she's only a receptacle. Well, this is an argument that's not going to wash much these days, but it persuaded half the Athenian jury. And so Athene herself used her casting vote to set Orestes free. And just as he was set free, who should turn up in Athens but the Furies? And as was their wont, they were furious. They said to Athene, they said, and this is the moment where you hear the hinges of history. They said to Athene, you young gods have usurped our role. Our duty, our role, was to avenge a terrible crime. But you, young gods, you've changed everything. You've made it different. What have you done? You've summoned a jury, jaw, and you've let this bloke off. And Athene said, yes, because this is a new world. No longer is it a case of revenge, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. It's a case where we've got to sit down and discuss things, work out what we're going to do, negotiate how we're going to live together. And that was the moment at which the warrior virtues gave way to the civic virtues, to the idea of people living together in communities. Now, of course, to this day, in Afghanistan and other places of conflict in our world, the warrior virtues are still very much in demand, alas. But most of what has happened in human history has been the application not of the warrior virtues, but of the civic virtues, of building communities and societies together on the basis of a new way of thinking about what virtue is. Actually, on the basis of thinking about ethos, about character, the character of an individual, the character of a community, a way that people should be and should act, and the kinds of values, the sets of values that give that shape, that colour to the lives of individuals. So in the backwards and forwards of history, in the tracings and retracings of different attitudes about how people live, you get moralities, and you sometimes get moralities which have a certain character, usually quite conventional, usually quite, again, to use that phrase, one size fits all in a community. Mainly, of course, to constrain the limits, that is, so that people don't, the activities of people don't spill over the boundaries too far. Although you know very well that if you could fly like Superman across the rooftops of London and peer with your X-ray vision into each one, you would be surprised and alarmed at what it is people do get up to and what the great variety of human experience is. We have some raw statistics on, I don't know, adultery and whatever else goes on under those roofs. But in fact, of course, the sheer variety of human experience is pretty extraordinary. And what the truths are of people's inner lives and desires and experiences is a very various truth. But the conventional morality of the day will provide some kind of constraint, keep the lid a bit on the boiling pot lid. But it is always ethical reflection, that is thinking about the nature of well-lived lives, of worthwhile lives, that brings about changes in the way that that lid is situated on the pot, sometimes more tightly, sometimes less so. And this is an important point for us because the more mature and reflective and civilized a society is, the more liberal it tends to be. This is an historical remark. I'll back it up in a moment with a point of interest. But you notice that when individuals become more mature and more relaxed about themselves and about people around them, in just the same way when a society becomes more mature and more relaxed, so it's better able to accommodate diversity and difference. Another thing you might have been reading in the bath last night is John Stuart Mill, his wonderful essay on liberty. And you will remember that in that essay he says, I'm much less worried by political tyranny than I am by social tyranny, the effort of our society around us to impose on us a very restricted conception of what's acceptable in the way of human living and human relationships. And what we really should permit is as many experiments as are possible and tolerable in the way that people can relate to one another and work out their destinies with one another. Always, of course, said Mill, under the government of what he called the harm principle, that is, the principle that we must do no harm, or at least as little harm as possible, to other people in their quest for living lives that are worthwhile. Now, it is very, very typical indeed of the moralist. The moralist is the person who says, I don't like it, therefore you are not allowed to do it. I don't like it, so you are not allowed to watch it or see it. That's the moralist attitude, trying to impose on other people a limitation out of their own anxiety or timidity or lack of experience or whatever it might be. I mean, some of you here in this room may remember Mrs. Mary Whitehouse. She was the only human being on the planet who had a television without an off button. So she was forced to watch all those nude scenes after 9 o'clock in the evening, which made her write all those letters. Somebody ought to have said to her, if you don't like it, switch the bloody thing off, you don't have to watch it. You know. What she said, well, I don't like it, so nobody else is allowed to see it. I want the BBC not to screen these things because I don't like it. A very typical moralistic attitude. An ethical attitude says, the idea of choice, the idea that people should live in ways that are expressive of what they are, providing they don't get in the way of other people who have similar quests, who want to try to make something of themselves and to foster and nurture their relationships and develop themselves as individuals. Providing you don't harm others or do as little harm as you can, because it's very hard, of course, to live without treading on ants and so on. So we do sometimes disconcert others, but try to minimize it in the way that Mill suggested, is what it is to be giving to others the one thing that one wants for oneself, which is the space, the opportunity to make something worthwhile. Of course, that is an expression really of the only form of the golden rule which stands up to scrutiny. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. But you have to remember what George Bernard Shaw said about the positive version, do to others what you would like them to do to you, because he said, hey, you shouldn't under any circumstances, because if you do to others what you'd like them to do to you, they may not like it. And of course, it's a very deep insight. So this idea about how we live, how we choose, how we allow others the same space that we need for ourselves, this idea that Mill offers us of the experimentation of ways that people might live and make good lives, is a very important component of the ethical. And that is why in this great question, how do we achieve the good? How do we make progress towards the good? We must do it under the rubric of the ethical rather than under the rubric of the moral. And then the life that we try to make, if we are trying to make a good life, will be good precisely because we are trying to make it good. Good, not in the moralistic sense of a sort of goody two-shoes, incredibly well-behaved kind of life, but good in the sense of really worth living. A life which has in it the depth, the tonalities, the movement towards something which is really worth having and worth being. Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes for any questions, comments, or complaints. Anybody like to ask? There, well, I think there's a microphone actually.
Oh, thank you. That was a great talk.
Yeah.
You sort of put yourself in the position of agony uncle of how to live a good life. So, my question is this. Living a good life, do you think in this is broad, but modern society, we've become disconnected from that earlier idea of, what was the term, not of happiness. Like if you say happiness to someone, they think feeling good, they think emotion, as opposed to something more akin to character and character building. This is something to do with wealth and our comfort zone and so on, but do you think we've lost that idea that actually ultimately to be happy, it's hard. You have to, it's indexed to character, to principle, to ethics, to doing the right thing, as opposed to emotional gratification. Things more indexed to morality and indeed immediate gratification. Do you think that's the case? And
I do to some extent, in this sense that many of the things that people reach for to make them happy, like the beach holiday or the new motor car or whatever it might be, tend to be things which may very well give pleasure. And to experience pleasure, of course, is to be happy at least part of the time, although the pleasure is poor. But it's too often the case that the things that people reach for are not actually happiness generating, but they're distractions from unhappiness, or the idea that unless there's some positive payback, some positive pleasure, some positive enjoyment, that you're not happy. One really interesting metric is that when you look at the increase of wealth, average income in a society, as people get a bit wealthier, so their degree to which they report happiness will rise with it, but only to a certain point. And then the continued rise of wealth is not traced by a continued rise of self-reporting of happiness. And so there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect there. And this, I think, is because of misdescription of the things that make us happy. Now, we all know, and they're tremendous cliches, and it's a great pity that they're cliches, because cliches tend to dissolve into the background and become part of the wallpaper. But the things that really do make people happy are things like their personal relationships, and things like the very simple avocations that give them a genuine sense of achievement, making, doing. it was also Walter Pater, I think, who said a person wrapped up in himself makes a very small parcel. So when you're looking at the world around you, and you feel a sense of engagement with others, sense of concern, especially when you realise that it's hard to be really happy when you're conscious of the fact that so many of our fellows in the human story are in places of conflict or suffering or deprivation. So to be a bit engaged in the big effort to make things a tiny bit better, to be part of the ameliorative process, is also very satisfying. So you're dead right. We misdescribe the kinds of things that count as happiness or that would make us happy. And to get back to things that are actually more direct and more simple is the right way to go. When we've learned that simplicity is not the same thing as shallowness, but that actually it's the same thing as depth. This is why in the case of Socrates I say his great insight that the life really worth living is the life that we've thought about and we've chosen for ourselves. That simple thought is a very deep one.
I was going to say, I was probably loud enough. I was going to say, I was lucky enough to have what you would describe as a classical education. And a lot of people poo-poo and laugh at our, Boris Johnsons and Camerons of the world when they say they studied Latin. You mentioned that you got into schools and were giving talks and stuff. How do you feel that we should approach being able to give our children this kind of understanding of life, which I'm pretty sure that most people in schools are not?
Mm. Yes, good question. Sometimes people poo-poo the idea of the classics without realizing that it was once the case in these sunny islands of ours that educated people had nothing but a classical education. They went off and ruled large parts of the world on the basis of it. You wonder how the heck they managed it. Well, of course, to read the classics, to read Latin and Greek, is to read philosophy and history and politics and the story of people who governed great empires in the past and so on. So classical education is a very rich education in the humanities. From the point of view of our school children now, alas, what we tend to do is to think about our schooling process as being one that produces foot soldiers for the economic war. People who can count enough and spell enough, to take their part in the work of the economy. And I often say, well, when you think about the amount of time people spend at work, and then you think that they are also voters and neighbours and travellers and lovers and parents and what have you, you recognise that actually education should be a much, much broader and richer thing than just what will get people ready for the world of work. Although, if people can get the jobs that they really enjoy doing, if, like the Chinese scholar who said, every morning I leap from my bed, swift as a thirsty cat, and hasten to my work, well, that would be a wonderful thing to do if you really loved what you were doing. So that would be the ideal. But then many, many, many people have to pay the rent, and so a job is a necessity. And there are other aspects of life which are significant. So we should be educating for that as well. And we've kind of given up on that, mainly because education is now a mass system. And it's difficult to manage many tens of thousands of people unless you can set them all the same exams at the same time. But this doesn't really trap the talent and the diversity that there is, especially in young people, full of hope and full of promise. Personally, footnote remark, I'm not a great believer in mass-produced education. I'm very sceptical about the value of A-levels, for example, to tell anybody what their real worth is, intellectually or as individuals. Many, many A-level students are a lot smarter than the examiners, which is why they sometimes don't get the grades that they would have got if they just ticked the boxes. And so as a university teacher, I think we should be looking at the individual and not at the paperwork, looking at what a person's real capacities are and not what scores they've got on the paper. But that would require of us a real revolution in how we think about education, really separating the training aspect, numeracy and literacy and the basics that people have, and thinking rather about challenging the way people think and broadening their minds and getting them to see that there are alternatives and inviting them to take risks and not to mind making mistakes and failing, because those are the ways that we learn best very
Well, you were just saying that it would require a revolution in education, but really, I mean, I endorse what you say about the considered life, the full life, the attentive life. But how then, we wouldn't, I mean, if everyone was doing that, how would society continue? I'll answer that. We wouldn't be able to have the society that we have now. Everyone would be challenging everything. So how do we, I have to declare an interest in that I'm an artist, and I have, at every point in my life, not done the easy thing. And I know how difficult it is, and I almost, if someone asked me, should I become an artist and do I do it? Well, I did it, but I don't know if I can advise it, because really, society everywhere is making it impossible for us to be individuals. I don't know if that's a question or an answer that you can answer.
Well, you in the immortal words of a former pupil of mine at Oxford, you've put your foot on something important here, which is, of course, that the great pressures in society are towards conformity, towards dragooning everybody into moving in the same direction in order to ensure the kinds of things that bring benefits from social living, division of labour, community of effort, pooling of resources, and so on. And the individuals in society are sometimes regarded as a bit disruptive because they're pushing against the stream and they're different. Now it might be, and there are some people who say, we need conformity so that we can have non-conformists. If they were, as you say, if everybody was a non-conformist, we would be like molecules of gas in a gas jar, all moving randomly in different directions. And then for that reason we wouldn't be putting together. But it's not quite like that actually, because it's not that everybody's a conformist or everybody's a non-conformist. It's that we can all of us see, if we're rational, we can all of us see that we do need to pool resources and pull together over some things. We see the point, for example, of paying taxes so that we can have a health service and roads and the defence force and the rest. But those areas of our lives which are our own and where we feel most creative, and that might be in our personal relationships, it might be in the work that we do as artists or as teachers. In those domains, there we have to grasp the opportunity to be ourselves and to do something which is original to us or which makes some kind of contribution. So it's possible, I think, to get both. And you only get both if the social system will allow it, if there is enough of a space for each individual in the society for people to have some area of play, some area where they can make choices that don't affect others in a harmful way, but which add value to the overall experience. And I think that kind of society fundamentally is going to be a small L liberal society, a tolerant society, one which celebrates diversity and difference and variety in human beings. That kind of society is one where that sort of flourishing can happen. I'm told to stop at 1:45. Are you making that movement yet? One more question. Because there was a lady at the back who's had a hand up. Your arm must be nearly dropped off.
It's just a comment on how when your life is full and considerate, and every single day passes really, really fast because you're doing all the things that you love and enjoy, and when you look past a week of this full life, it's oh, it went so fast and you don't know how it went. And then at the end of the life, your life was really short, even though it was really, really, really long, even though it was and it was really, really full. But when your life is really, really boring and dull, every single day feels really, really long. And it's just this controversy of how the perception of time is not existent.
Well, you're reverting here to the phenomenon that people who don't smoke or drink don't actually live longer than anybody else. It just feels as if they do that. But it's not quite like this. You have to remember that it can be a feature of the very full life that you sometimes just lie in bed and twiddle your toes. That could be one. This is a very important point, this to reclaim to oneself as, in a very, very secular, non-spooky sense of the word spiritual, but to reclaim as spiritual exercises, things like a walk in the country or dinner with friends or just lying in bed on a Sunday morning or reading a good book, that those things which refresh us and which speak to that complex of our emotions and intellectual attitudes which constitutes our deepest self. But those are the things that really vivify us. And there are moments, the moments of pause and of reflection and quietness, and when we're listening to ourselves, listening to our own heartbeat and seeing the pattern of its rhythms and of our lives overall, that we get the sense that we're living something very capacious. A life worth living is one which is full of room. And in fact, there's a lovely saying which sums it up, and that is that a full heart always has room for more, but an empty heart has room for nothing. Okay, thank you very much.